What does it mean when help arrives before danger has a name? Across modern life, we trust what can be measured. A phone rings because someone dialed. A message appears because someone sent it. A warning matters because it can be traced to a source, verified, logged, explained. We build our days around that faith in systems, schedules, signals, causes that lead neatly to effects. And yet, now and then, a story surfaces that refuses to stay inside those lines. Not a story of monsters or secret empires. Something quieter than that, more intimate. A voice on a phone at the exact right moment. A note discovered where no note should be. A screen displaying knowledge it could not possibly possess. A rescue set in motion before anyone had cried for help. In each case, the details differ. The people are ordinary professionals, parents, pilots, doctors, engineers. Their lives are grounded in routine evidence and responsibility. None of them set out to become witnesses to mystery, but all of them encountered the same unsettling pattern: intervention without origin, guidance without authorship, precision without explanation. Maybe these events were extraordinary coincidences, stitched together by frightened minds looking for order. Maybe they reveal how often human intuition, hidden networks, and chance quietly shape our survival. Or maybe they point towards something harder to name, a form of intelligence moving just beyond the edge of what we can recognize. This is not a story about proving the impossible. It is a story about standing at the boundary between knowledge and uncertainty, where the most unsettling thing is not that someone may be watching, but that our lives may be more deeply connected, more vulnerable, and more mysterious than we ever imagined. It begins, as many modern mysteries do, with a single phone call on an ordinary morning. What if the first warning sounded less like a miracle and more like an interruption? The morning was built for routine. Traffic lights changed on their usual rhythm. Coffee cooled in a paper cup between the seats. David Morrison, an investment banker with a life measured in deadlines and forecasts, was driving toward a meeting that carried more weight than he cared to admit. If it went badly, people in his firm would feel it. If it went well, a year of uncertainty might finally loosen its grip. Then his phone rang. The number looked local at first glance, familiar enough to stir a reflex, but something about it felt wrong, as if the sequence had been assembled to imitate a real call without belonging to the world of real exchanges. When he answered, a calm male voice spoke with no greeting and no urgency. "Take the alternate route," it said. "Your usual road is blocked. There's been an accident ahead." David frowned and kept driving. In a city full of delays, vague warnings were easy to dismiss. He assumed it was a prank, a cross signal, maybe some strange automated error. But 10 minutes later, he saw it. Metal bent against metal, brake lights pulling red across the lane, emergency vehicles only just beginning to arrive. The crash looked fresh, almost as if it had unfolded in the narrow space between the warning and his arrival. He sat there, engine idling, feeling a new kind of silence. The call had not saved his life in the dramatic sense. No one had pulled him from a river or from a burning room. It had done something subtler. It had nudged the day by a few degrees, and in doing so altered its outcome. He took the detour, reached the meeting on time, and closed the deal that kept his firm from slipping deeper into trouble. By evening, he had almost convinced himself there was an explanation. A traffic monitor, a lucky guess, someone with early access to road data. Yet none of those answers accounted for the tone of the voice, or the timing, or the odd feeling that the caller had known exactly when he would still be uncertain enough to listen. Sometimes the beginning of a mystery is not a catastrophe. Sometimes it is a small correction in the middle of an ordinary day. And maybe that is what unsettles us most. The idea that our lives can be changed not only by grand events, but by a single sentence, arriving one moment before the world reveals why it mattered. How do you explain a warning that arrives before the emergency itself becomes visible? For days, David tried to fold the incident back into the architecture of reason. He checked his phone log, called the number again, searched for anything that might reduce the moment to a technical anomaly. There was no clear owner, no customer service trail, no ordinary explanation waiting at the end of a menu tree. The number seemed to exist only long enough to reach him, and then it slipped back into silence. That might have been the end of it. A strange event, an anecdote, the sort of story people tell at dinner parties, half embarrassed by how it sounds once spoken aloud. But months later, something happened that changed the scale of the question. Late one night in another city, another life was moving through its own careful routine. Maria Chen, a trauma surgeon, had just finished a punishing shift. Hospitals at that hour carry a strange atmosphere, somewhere between fatigue and vigil. Fluorescent light flattens the world. Conversations become fragments. Every face looks as though it belongs to someone standing between control and collapse. As Maria left the building, her pager activated with a code she recognized instantly. Incoming multi-car collision. Severe injuries expected. She turned back without hesitation, already calculating blood loss, fracture patterns, airway risk. But when she reached the emergency department, there was confusion instead of chaos. No crash had been reported. No ambulances were inbound. The board was blank. 10 minutes later, the first siren appeared. Then another. Then a convoy of emergency vehicles carrying victims from a highway pileup almost exactly matching the alert she had received before anyone else seemed to know it had happened. Because she had returned early, Maria and her team were ready. Supplies were laid out. Staff had been pulled into position. The first critical patients met preparation instead of panic. In medicine, minutes can separate recovery from grief. Maria understood that better than most. Yet what stayed with her was not only the lives likely preserved that night, it was the impossible sequence. The message had not predicted in poetic terms. It had arrived with clinical precision, as if some hidden observer had seen the event before the world around her had caught up. We like to think information travels in orderly ways, from incident to witness, from witness to report, from report to response. But every so often a story appears that reverses the direction. First the knowing, then the event. And when that happens, we are left with an old, human question in modern form. Is reality always unfolding in front of us, or do parts of it sometimes reach us from just beyond the frame? What if the strangest part of a warning is not that it is accurate, but that it seems tailored to the private language of one person's life? Maria did what trained professionals do when confronted with the improbable. She documented everything she could remember: time of the alert, exact wording, the sequence of arrivals. She asked the hospital's IT department to trace the pager signal, expecting some obscure software glitch, a misrouted emergency bulletin, perhaps an internal test sent at the wrong hour. But the system logs offered no comfort. The code that summoned her had not moved through the usual channels. It appeared without a clean origin, like a footprint with no visible path leading toward it. For a while, she said almost nothing. There is a loneliness in unusual experience, especially for people whose work depends on credibility. Surgeons are trained to trust procedure, not atmosphere. They rely on repeatable steps, not private intuitions. To admit that a message arrived from nowhere and changed the outcome of a trauma response was to step into a space where language itself became unstable. Every explanation sounded either too simple or too wild. Then another account surfaced. In Northern California, a commercial pilot named Alan Pierce was preparing for a short regional flight on a morning of low clouds and disciplined calm. The aircraft had passed inspection. Weather reports were manageable. Nothing in the pre-flight briefing suggested more than the ordinary negotiations every pilot makes with air, timing, and machinery. But as Alan settled into the cockpit, he noticed something unusual on his tablet: a maintenance advisory attached to his flight plan, warning of a fault in a system that, according to the official records, had already been cleared days earlier. He almost ignored it. Pilots live among alerts. Some matter, some are ghosts left behind by outdated databases and administrative lag. But something in the wording caught his attention. It referenced a subsystem by the nickname Alan's old instructor used decades before, a phrase too informal, too personal, too dated to belong in a modern automated notice. He paused the departure and requested a secondary inspection. The mechanic's first reaction was skepticism. The second was silence. Buried deep in the aircraft's instrumentation was a fault that could have turned dangerous in flight, subtle enough to escape the earlier check, serious enough that, under the wrong conditions, it might have cascaded into catastrophe. The flight was delayed, the passengers complained, paperwork multiplied, and dozens of people boarded another aircraft later that day, unaware that the inconvenience may have been the gentlest form of rescue. A pattern was beginning to emerge, though not yet publicly, not yet cleanly. The messages did not arrive like thunderbolts from a myth. They came through familiar systems: phones, pagers, tablets, screens. They borrowed the tools of ordinary life, but each carried an intimacy that made the experience harder to dismiss. The warning was not merely correct, it seemed to know how to be believed. And perhaps that is what every human being is searching for in moments of uncertainty. Not just truth, but truth spoken in a voice we are able to hear. Could a machine carry a message that no machine was ever designed to send? Alan Pierce had spent most of his adult life learning the difference between fear and useful caution. In aviation, that distinction is sacred. Panic narrows judgment. Discipline widens it. So when the mechanic confirmed the hidden defect, Alan did not feel vindicated so much as unsettled. The problem was real. The advisory had been right, but the route by which it reached him remained impossible to chart. He kept returning to that phrase on the screen, the old nickname for the failing system. It belonged to another era of his life, back when he was a young trainee trying to memorize checklists in a cramped simulator, while an instructor with tobacco-stained fingers turned every technical lesson into a story. No modern airline database should have known that language. No standardized alert should have sounded so personal. For weeks, Alan said nothing outside a narrow circle of colleagues. But stories like these have a way of finding one another, quietly at first, through a friend of a friend, through an engineer who had heard about the banker, through a nurse who knew someone at Maria's hospital. None of the events matched exactly, yet each seemed to rhyme with the others. A warning arrived early. The source could not be verified. The content was precise, often uncannily so, and the outcome, if the message was trusted, tilted away from harm. Then came the case that pushed the pattern beyond professionals and into the intimate territory of family. In a suburb outside Chicago, a widowed father named Thomas Reed was asleep in his armchair when his home security system chimed just after midnight. It was not the harsh alarm reserved for forced entry, but a softer notification, the kind that marked motion detected in the backyard. Half awake, he checked the monitor beside the television. For an instant, the display showed what looked like his daughter standing by the old swing set, though she was away at college 3 states over. Then the image vanished. A second message appeared on the screen. Check the basement door. Thomas felt the kind of chill that begins not in the skin, but somewhere deeper, where memory and instinct overlap. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked through the darkened house toward the rear stairwell. The basement door, which he always locked before bed, was open by a narrow margin. Just outside, a man in gloves was crouched beside the frame, working silently with a tool Thomas could not identify in the beam of the light. The intruder ran. Thomas called the police. No one was hurt. Later, officers suggested the monitor image was probably a glitch, a corrupted feed, some artifact of stored footage crossing with the live camera. Thomas wanted to believe them. Yet even after the locks were changed and the reports were filed, one detail stayed with him more than the attempted break-in itself. The system had not simply detected motion. It had told him where to look. Technology is often described as cold, but that is only partly true. It reflects the warmth and fear of the people who build it, the habits of the people who rely on it, the private histories woven into its use. Perhaps that is why these incidents felt so haunting. The messages did not come from some distant cosmic theater. They appeared inside the trusted objects of ordinary life, as if mystery had learned to speak through the very tools we use to keep mystery at bay. And once that possibility enters the mind, even briefly, the world feels less like a machine and more like a conversation we have not yet learned how to understand. Why do some of the most unsettling mysteries begin not in public crises, but in the private rooms where grief still lives? Thomas Reed could explain the attempted break-in. Police reports made that part simple. A prowler had likely been watching the neighborhood, testing doors, waiting for the silence that suggests a house occupied by one person. What he could not explain was the image that appeared first, the brief vision of his daughter by the swing set, still and pale in the blue light of the monitor, as if memory itself had stepped into the frame to make sure he would pay attention. To anyone else, that detail might have sounded like exhaustion. To Thomas, It felt personal in a way he could not dismiss. His wife had died 3 years earlier. Since then, the house had changed character, not physically. The same photographs lined the hallway. The same dishes sat in the cabinets. But grief alters sound, light, and distance. It makes familiar rooms feel larger at night and ordinary objects strangely watchful. Thomas had learned to live inside that quiet. He had even made peace with it, most days. Yet the screen's brief image seemed to know exactly which face would move him from hesitation to action. That was becoming the deepest common thread in these accounts. The messages did not merely warn. They crossed the threshold into intimate knowledge. Around this time, a journalist named Elaine Porter began hearing fragments of the same pattern from unrelated sources. Elaine was not interested in paranormal spectacle. She had built a career on long-form reporting, the patient kind that values documents over rumors and context over noise. Her specialty was human systems under stress. Hospitals, transit networks, emergency response, fragile infrastructures where technology and emotion meet. The stories finding her inbox sounded too strange to publish and too consistent to ignore. She began making calls. The banker with the impossible traffic warning. The trauma surgeon summoned before the crash. The pilot saved by an advisory that knew an old nickname. The widowed father led to a basement door by a screen that seemed to understand his private tenderness. Each case had gaps. Each invited skepticism, yet each also carried something many fabricated stories lack: restraint. No one claimed to know what had happened. No one tried to turn it into doctrine. They were not promoting a theory. They were describing a rupture in their understanding of ordinary cause and effect. Elaine noticed another pattern as she listened. In every case, the warning arrived through a system already designed to receive urgent information. A phone, a pager, a cockpit display, a home monitor. It was as if whatever force lay behind these moments, whether human, technical, or something less defined, preferred familiar doors over dramatic entrances. That detail mattered to her. Human beings rarely accept truth in raw form. We accept it through context, through trusted channels, through voices and objects we have already learned to obey. A warning shouted from the void might be ignored, but a warning whispered through a device on the kitchen counter, or a screen in a cockpit, or a pager clipped to a tired surgeon's waist can redirect the course of a life. Elaine did not yet know what she was investigating. A hidden communications network? A pattern of misidentified but meaningful glitches? An emergent intelligence in the systems people depend on every day? She resisted the temptation to name it too soon. Because names can be comforting, and comfort is often the enemy of attention. So she kept listening. And the more she listened, the more one possibility began to trouble her. Perhaps the real mystery was not that these warnings existed, but that they appeared to understand the human heart well enough to know exactly how to be believed. What if the search for an explanation reveals less about the messages themselves than about the invisible architecture of modern trust? Elaine Porter approached the mystery the way experienced reporters approach any fragile story. By trying to break it, she wanted contradictions, technical dead ends, ordinary explanations hiding beneath extraordinary timing. She filed requests for system logs, interviewed telecom specialists, consulted emergency dispatch veterans, and sat with software engineers who had spent years studying the small, unreliable ghosts that live inside complex networks. Delayed packets, corrupted timestamps, cached images, phantom notifications. There was no shortage of mechanisms that could produce confusion, but confusion was not the problem. The problem was coherence. Each event contained too much situational intelligence. The banker's call arrived before traffic reporting caught up. The surgeon's pager described an emergency before the emergency entered the hospital system. The pilot's advisory used language no current database should have preserved. Thomas's security monitor did not merely trigger. It directed his attention toward the exact point of danger. Random error could distort information. It could scramble, duplicate, or delay. What it was not supposed to do, at least not repeatedly, was become strangely meaningful. Elaine began speaking with psychologists as well as engineers. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, they reminded her. We shape coincidence into narrative because narrative makes uncertainty bearable. Under stress, the mind is especially willing to connect dots that do not belong together. A life saved by chance often becomes, in memory, a life saved for a reason. She knew all of that. She had written versions of that argument herself, and yet, sitting in kitchens and hospital offices and quiet airport conference rooms, she encountered something more difficult than belief and harder than disbelief. She met people who were not trying to magnify what happened. They were trying to reduce it, trying to make it smaller, safer, more ordinary than it felt. Their restraint gave the stories a weight that sensationalism never could. One evening, while reviewing notes under the amber light of her apartment desk lamp, Elaine wrote a sentence in the margin of her notebook. The system behaves as if someone understands urgency in human terms. She stared at that line for a long time, not because she accepted it, but because of how dangerous it was to consider. If true, even in part, it suggested that the boundary between technical systems and human intuition might be thinner than society prefers to admit. Perhaps these incidents were the accidental byproduct of hidden interconnections too complex for any one institution to map. Or perhaps something inside our networks was doing what all living minds eventually learn to do: identify what matters, choose a voice, and intervene at the edge of harm. By then, Elaine's investigation had ceased to be only about unexplained warnings. It had become a study of dependence. We live surrounded by instruments that observe us, anticipate us, complete our sentences, predict our routes, register our habits, and quietly learn the contours of our fear. We call it convenience, efficiency, personalization. But beneath those practical names lies a more intimate reality. Our machines now sit close enough to our lives to recognize the shape of our vulnerability. The old dream was that technology would make the world more knowable. The new unease is that it may know us in return. And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer whether someone was watching. It is what watching becomes when the line between protection and understanding begins to blur. What kind of intelligence would choose a grocery cart over a command center? Elaine found the next account almost too domestic to believe. No cockpit, no hospital corridor, no trading floor humming with risk, just fluorescent aisles, cereal boxes, and the soft repetition of family life, which perhaps is why it stayed with her longer than the others. Sarah Chen first noticed the message folded inside a sealed carton of breakfast cereal. At first glance, it looked like a prank or a factory error, a scrap of paper caught where it did not belong. But the handwriting was deliberate, almost careful. The note warned that her youngest daughter might react badly to a new prescription and urged her to ask for an alternative before the second dose. It included a detail about the child's condition that Sarah had never posted online, never discussed publicly, and barely understood herself. She almost threw it away. Instead, out of caution more than belief, she called the pharmacist. The answer was unsettling. In rare cases, children with a certain profile could indeed respond badly to that medication. The note had not sounded dramatic. It had simply arrived before the danger had a chance to declare itself. Then more messages began to appear. One inside a package of pasta, advising her to postpone a planned drive until a vehicle part could be checked. Weeks later, the manufacturer announced a recall. Another tucked beneath the cardboard flap of a snack box, suggesting a different route to school before roadwork turned an ordinary intersection into a knot of hazard and delay. Another impossibly warning her family to avoid a specific food item days before contamination reports reached the news. The messages were never broad, never vague. They were tailored with unnerving intimacy, as though someone understood the choreography of her household better than she did, which food she bought, which package she would open first, which worries she carried privately after the children were asleep. Store managers found no evidence of tampering. Manufacturers denied any role. Security cameras showed nothing unusual. The packages appeared sealed, untouched, ordinary in every visible way. And yet they carried knowledge that seemed to move ahead of public information, ahead of bureaucratic response, ahead even of family conversation. For Sarah, the deepest disturbance was not the practical question of how the notes got there. It was the feeling that someone or something had studied the private grammar of her life and chosen the gentlest possible form in which to intervene. Not a siren, not a threat, just a scrap of paper waiting among groceries. There is something profoundly human about that image. We imagine mystery arriving through storms, through grand revelations, through doors thrown open in the night. But often what changes us enters quietly, hidden inside the ordinary. A note in a cupboard, a sentence in the middle of dinner preparations, a warning folded into the rituals that keep a family moving from one day to the next. And maybe that is why such stories linger, because they suggest that the border between the everyday and the unknowable is not far away at all. It may be resting in our hands already, disguised as something we were certain we understood. How do you keep living normally once the ordinary world has begun answering back? By the time Sarah Chen agreed to speak with Elaine, she had already made a private decision. She would not turn her life into a crusade. She would not go on television. She would not feed online forums hungry for certainty. She had children, bills, laundry, dentist appointments, forms to sign, meals to prepare. Whatever was happening, she refused to let it become the center of the household. And yet, like a faint sound behind a wall, it was always there. Elaine understood that instinct immediately. The people at the center of these events were not drawn toward mystery. They were pulled away from stability by it. Again and again, what she saw was not excitement, but reluctance. A banker who kept redialing a number that no longer belonged to anyone. A surgeon who wrote down times and codes as if documentation might restore causality. A pilot replaying a maintenance notice in his mind, trying to decide whether memory had added the part that felt personal. A father checking his security monitor each night with a kind of cautious gratitude he did not know how to describe. A mother turning over cereal boxes in the kitchen light, hoping to find nothing. That emotional pattern mattered. Fraud usually seeks attention. Delusion often seeks coherence. But these witnesses were doing something else. They were trying to preserve the world they already trusted. Their stories carried hesitation, not performance. None of them claimed complete understanding. Most wished the incidents had never happened at all. Elaine's notes were growing dense with paradox. The warnings appeared through systems built for communication, but without verifiable senders. They predicted danger in ways that suggested access to real-time or even premature knowledge. They often used the emotional vocabulary most likely to break through a person's doubt. And above all, they remained limited. No grand manifesto followed. No universal theory announced itself. The messages intervened, then receded. That restraint made them harder to categorize. If the source was human, it implied a hidden network of astonishing reach and precision, one able to monitor private lives, predict unfolding events, and deliver targeted warnings without leaving a usable trace. If the source was technical, then some emergent process inside the systems of modern life had become capable of startlingly contextual decisions. If neither explanation was sufficient, Elaine was left facing a more uncomfortable possibility. That reality sometimes presents meaningful patterns before explanation is ready to receive them. She hated that sentence even as she wrote it, not because it sounded mystical, but because it threatened the discipline she depended on. Journalism, like science, begins with humility before evidence. But evidence does not always arrive in forms that flatter our methods. Some truths are measurable only after they have already changed us. Late one night, Elaine spread photographs, transcripts, and call records across her dining table. From a distance, it looked like an investigation. Up close, it looked almost like grief work, the careful arrangement of fragments around an absence that refuses to stay empty. She realized then that all these stories, whatever their source, revolved around the same ancient human longing. To believe that when danger comes, someone or something might notice before we do. Perhaps that desire makes us vulnerable to illusion. Or perhaps it reveals a hidden fact about human life, that survival has always depended on forms of attention we do not fully understand, from instinct to intuition to systems so complex they resemble fate. Either way, the mystery was no longer just about unexplained warnings. It was about what people do after being touched by one. They return to work, they make dinner, they pay invoices, they pack school lunches. But beneath those motions, a new awareness begins to live. That certainty is thinner than it appears, and that the world may contain forms of care, surveillance, coincidence, or intelligence that do not ask our permission before entering the story. What happens when a pattern grows too consistent to dismiss, yet still refuses to become proof? Elaine's investigation had reached the stage where every new case brought less surprise and more unease. The individual stories still differed in texture and circumstance, but together they had begun to form a recognizable shape, like stars gradually revealing a constellation no one had meant to draw. The warnings arrived early. They moved through familiar channels. They were intimate, specific, and strangely economical. No speeches, no explanations, only intervention. Then she found the case that shifted the mystery from isolated survival to collective consequence. In a mid-sized manufacturing town in Ohio, a facilities manager named Robert Hale was reviewing overnight diagnostics at a water treatment plant when an alert flashed across a maintenance terminal. The wording was blunt: isolate the eastern filtration line immediately. At first, he assumed it was a delayed command from central monitoring, though the timestamp made little sense. The line had passed its last inspection. Nothing on the dashboard showed an emergency. Still, something in the alert sequencing unsettled him. It skipped the layered bureaucratic phrasing typical of official notices and went straight to action, as though urgency had stripped away protocol. Robert paused the system, redirected flow, and ordered a manual check. Within the hour, technicians found contamination entering through a compromised section that had not yet triggered the plant's standard thresholds. It was early enough to contain, early enough to prevent a wider breach. For the people in nearby homes filling kettles, washing fruit, or giving their children glasses of water before school, the danger never became visible, which is another way of saying the warning worked so well that most of the town would never know it had mattered. Robert was not a mystical man. He distrusted vague language and adored process charts. But when Elaine interviewed him, he kept returning to the same phrase. The message knew where the weak point was before the system admitted it. That idea disturbed her because it echoed everything she had already heard. The warnings did not merely react faster than institutions. They often seemed to recognize fragility before official detection caught up. Not just accidents and intrusions, but points of failure hidden inside infrastructures people rarely think about until something goes wrong. A road, a hospital intake board, an aircraft subsystem, a basement door, a child's prescription, a municipal water line. Seen together, they describe modern life itself, a vast mesh of dependencies so intricate that safety often rests on thin margins and silent mechanisms. Perhaps the real revelation was not supernatural at all. Perhaps these stories exposed how vulnerable society has become and how desperately we rely on signals, often unseen, to protect us from cascading harm. Yet that explanation only carried Elaine so far. Because vulnerability alone could not account for the message's strange timing, their private language, or their eerie ability to arrive in the form most likely to be trusted. They behaved less like alarms and more like acts of interpretation. And interpretation, in human terms, is never neutral. It requires selecting what matters from everything else. That was the thought she could not shake. Somewhere inside all of this, whether in hidden human coordination, emergent machine behavior, or a deeper form of coincidence not yet understood, something was deciding. Not everything deserved warning. Not every risk was named. But some moments, some people, some fractures in the ordinary flow of life were being noticed with astonishing care. The question was no longer whether the pattern existed. The question was, what kind of presence, system, or intelligence chooses certain thresholds as worthy of intervention, and what it means to live in a world where help may arrive not from certainty, but from something that sees the crack before the surface breaks. Can a mystery remain humane once we stop asking only whether it is real and begin asking what it reveals about us? By now, Elaine had enough testimony to draft an article. Any editor would have seen the appeal. Unexplained warnings, lives redirected, systems behaving with impossible intimacy. But each time she tried to shape the material into publication, something resisted. Not fear exactly. Responsibility. The facts, as facts, were incomplete. There were logs without origins, messages without senders, memories sharpened by shock, and outcomes that seemed almost too precise. She could report the events. She could quote the witnesses. She could trace the edges of what did not fit. But she could not, with integrity, pretend to know what force connected them. So instead of writing for print, she kept listening. What emerged was not merely a record of anomalies, but a portrait of how people change when certainty loosens. David had become more patient in traffic, less convinced that efficiency was the highest form of intelligence. Maria found herself pausing longer in the emergency department before each shift, looking at the faces around her with a renewed sense that preparedness is partly technical and partly moral. Alan returned to the cockpit with the same discipline as before, yet with a quieter respect for the possibility that caution sometimes arrives from outside formal procedure. Thomas began calling his daughter more often, no longer postponing tenderness as though time were guaranteed. Sarah, for all her unease, paid closer attention to the ordinary rituals of care that structure a family's life. None of them became evangelists, as damn evangelists. That may be the most important part of the story. They did not build doctrines from what happened. They built attentiveness. The experiences left them less certain, but also more awake, more aware of the delicate dependencies beneath daily life, more willing to admit that survival often involves forms of help we do not recognize in the moment they appear. Elaine saw in that transformation something larger than mystery. The modern world teaches mastery. Measure the risk, model the system, secure the perimeter, predict the outcome. These are useful ambitions, even noble ones. But they can tempt us into forgetting that life is also shaped by contingency, by relationship, by intuition, by the quiet interventions that arrive through people, institutions, habits, and perhaps occasionally through channels we do not yet understand. A culture obsessed with proof can become strangely blind to meaning. Not false meaning, not superstition dressed as certainty, but the kind that emerges when human beings confront events that exceed their frameworks and respond not with arrogance, but with humility. That was what Elaine found most moving in the people she interviewed. They had not been made smaller by uncertainty. In some ways, they had been made gentler. Perhaps that is one of mystery's hidden gifts. It can interrupt the illusion that we are isolated, self-sufficient, and fully informed. It can remind us that beneath the polished surfaces of devices and routines, our lives are threaded together by trust, timing, and fragile acts of attention. Some of those acts come from other people, some from institutions working as they should, some from luck, and some seem to arrive from a place we cannot yet map. Whatever their source, they ask the same thing of us in return, to notice one another before the damage is done. And maybe that is where the deepest revelation has been waiting all along. Not in the messages themselves, but in the human response they call forth when the world briefly becomes more mysterious and therefore more precious than we had allowed ourselves to believe. What if the final barrier to understanding is not technology, but our discomfort with limits? Elaine eventually brought a small group together in the same room, not for publication, not for spectacle, just a quiet meeting in a rented conference space above a public library, where the carpet smelled faintly of dust and old rain, and the windows looked out over a parking lot washed in afternoon light. David came. Maria came. Alan, Thomas, and Sarah as well. For the first time, each could measure their private experience against the others without the distortion of rumor. What struck them first was not how identical the stories were, but how humanly specific they remained. David spoke about the phone call that changed a business day and perhaps a career. Maria described the premature pager alert and the strange moral weight of being ready before catastrophe had formally arrived. Alan recalled the advisory that used the nickname from his training years, and how that small, intimate detail overrode professional skepticism. Thomas talked slowly about the basement door, about the image of his daughter, about grief as a language through which warning had somehow reached him. Sarah, with visible reluctance, unfolded copies of the notes that had appeared in packages across months of family life, each one domestic and precise, as though written by an intelligence that understood shopping lists as clearly as emergency protocols. No one tried to persuade anyone else. That, again, was the remarkable thing. The room was full of testimony, but almost no certainty. When they did speculate, they did so carefully. Could the events point to a hidden safety network? Some unauthorized layer of observation embedded inside everyday systems? Could advanced predictive analytics, stitched across databases and behavioral patterns, be generating warnings that surfaced in bizarre ways? Could human memory, under pressure, be refining coincidence into coherence after the fact? Or were they standing at the edge of something language still failed to hold? A pattern real enough to act on the world, but not yet legible to the frameworks built to explain it. They stayed with the questions longer than the answers. As the light outside softened toward evening, the conversation shifted, less toward mechanism, more toward consequence. What do such events do to a person's sense of agency? How do you preserve reason without flattening wonder? How do you remain ethically grounded when confronted with something that feels purposeful but cannot be proven? No one in the room wanted mystification, but neither did they want reduction so aggressive that it erased what they had actually lived. That tension may be one of the defining tensions of our age. We inhabit systems of immense complexity and call them ordinary because we depend on them every day. Networks speak to networks. Sensors watch thresholds. Algorithms anticipate behavior. Invisible infrastructures regulate water, air traffic, medicine traffic flow, financial risk, domestic security, and the timing of information itself. It is entirely possible that unexplained events will increasingly emerge not from the supernatural, but from the sheer density of interconnection we have created. Yet even that explanation leaves the deepest human question intact. Why do certain moments feel less like data and more like being addressed? Perhaps because to be warned is not only to receive information, it is to feel seen at the exact point where ignorance becomes danger. By the time the group left the library, nothing had been solved. No grand theory had won the room. No single explanation had carried the full emotional and factual weight of the experiences. But a different kind of clarity had emerged. Mystery does not always ask us to surrender reason. Sometimes it asks us to widen it, to make room for the possibility that reality contains more forms of pattern, perception, and care than our current language can comfortably admit. And maybe maturity, whether personal or civilizational, begins there, not in claiming certainty too quickly, but in learning how to stand at the edge of the unknown without turning away. What remains after the mystery is not solved, but absorbed into the way a person sees the world. Months passed. The urgency faded, as urgency always does, but the stories did not disappear. They settled into the background of each life like a second weather pattern. Invisible to outsiders yet always present, David still drove to meetings and watched markets rise and fall, but he no longer mistook control for understanding. Maria returned to the emergency department's relentless tempo, where alarms and footsteps and clipped voices filled the hours, yet some private part of her remained alert to the idea that readiness can begin before evidence is complete. Alan flew. Thomas slept more lightly. Sarah opened packages with a glance that was almost ceremonial. Elaine kept her notes, unfinished and unresolved, in a box she did not label. In another kind of story, this would be the place where the hidden mechanism is finally exposed. A whistleblower steps forward, a classified program is revealed. A line of code is found humming beneath the surface of ordinary systems, assigning importance, tracking vulnerability, sending help through whatever channel a person is most likely to trust. Or else the opposite. The entire sequence is elegantly debunked. Bang! Each event reduced to a chain of misunderstood signals, memory distortions, lucky timing, and human need. The world closes neatly again. Mystery is either crowned or dismissed. But real life is rarely that obedient. Some experiences do not end with resolution. They end with accommodation. We learn to live beside them. We let them complicate us. We carry them not as conclusions, but as questions that continue to work on the mind over time. That may be why these accounts resist both cynicism and belief in their purest forms. They ask for something more difficult than either, sustained uncertainty without indifference. And uncertainty, when held honestly, can deepen a life. Elaine came to see that the greatest change in her witnesses was not fear. It was attention. Each had become more sensitive to the fragile weave of modern existence, the quiet systems that sustain daily life, the hidden thresholds at which safety becomes risk, the dependence each person bears on strangers, institutions, habits, and split-second decisions. The unexplained warnings, whatever their source, had illuminated something already true. Human life has always depended on signals received in time. A glance across a crowded room, a nurse noticing the subtle change in a patient's breathing, a pilot hearing the wrong note in an engine, a parent waking just before a child calls out. Much of civilization is built on the grace of timely perception. Maybe that is why these stories feel so haunting. They do not simply suggest surveillance or prediction. They suggest care at a distance, attention without announcement, intervention without ownership. And whether that care came from hidden people, emergent systems, improbable chance, or something our vocabulary has not yet caught up with, it touched a nerve that runs through every era of human history. The hope that we are not entirely alone when the moment of danger arrives. There is no proof here strong enough to silence doubt, but there is also no doubt strong enough to erase what these people felt when a warning reached them before the world explained why. In that space between fact and meaning, they found no doctrine, no certainty, no final answer, only a more sober wonder. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the wisest response to a mystery is not to force it into a system too small to hold it, but to let it enlarge our sense of what a human life really is: vulnerable, connected, observed in ways we only partly understand, and always moving through a world where the next saving signal may arrive from a source we never see. And if that is true, then the final lesson is not about being watched. It is about learning to watch more carefully ourselves, each other, our systems, our assumptions, our moments of hesitation, so that when the unseen edges of life begin to shift, we might become, for one another, the warning that arrives in time. So where does a story like this finally come to rest? Not with proof, not with a confession from some hidden architect behind the curtain, not with a tidy verdict that converts uncertainty into certainty and lets everyone go home unchanged. It rests instead where many of the deepest human stories have always rested, in the uneasy, beautiful territory between explanation and meaning. By the end, the warnings remained what they had always been: brief intrusions into ordinary life that arrived just before harm could fully emerge. A phone call that redirected a morning, a hospital alert that created precious minutes, a cockpit message that turned caution into rescue, a home monitor hour that guided a father to the exact threshold of danger. Notes hidden in groceries, a terminal prompt at a water plant, fragments of intervention woven through the practical systems of modern existence. None of it added up to a doctrine. All of it added up to a feeling that reality is sometimes more attentive than we know. Maybe the truest interpretation is also the most modest one. These stories remind us that life is built on seen and unseen forms of care. Some are easy to name: engineers maintaining invisible infrastructure, nurses noticing subtle change, dispatchers making the right call, neighbors paying attention, parents acting on instinct, strangers choosing responsibility over indifference. Others are harder to classify. Patterns align, intuition sharpens, systems behave in ways we did not design but somehow still answer a need. Whether we call that coincidence, emergence, providence, or simply the unfinished edge of human knowledge, the emotional truth remains the same. We survive more often than we realize because something or someone notices in time. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation at the heart of all this. The world does not become less rational when we admit its mysteries. It becomes more complete. Reason helps us test what happened. Humility helps us live with what we cannot yet explain. Between the two, a more mature kind of wonder becomes possible, one that does not ask us to abandon evidence, only to remember that evidence is not the whole of experience. In the end, the question was never only whether we are being watched. It was whether attention itself, human, technological, accidental, or something still unnamed, might be one of the hidden forces that binds fragile lives together. Whether, in the moments before disaster hardens into fact, some signal can still cross the distance between danger and response. Whether memory, care, and awareness are closer cousins than we have imagined. And if that possibility leaves us unsettled, perhaps it should. Because to live honestly is to accept that we move through a world we do not fully command. A world of thresholds and blind corners, of systems we trust and limits we barely perceive, of losses narrowly avoided and meanings only half understood. Yet it is also a world where the smallest intervention, a sentence, a signal, a pause, a glance can alter the course of a life. That may be the most enduring truth of all. Not that the mystery was solved, but that it changed the way we see one another. It asked us to become more alert, more gentle, less arrogant about what we know. It suggested that beyond the noise of modern life, there may still be room for awe, for the kind that makes us more responsible, not less, more human, not less. And perhaps the final question is the one we carry forward quietly after the story ends. If a warning came in time, would we recognize it? And more importantly, could we become that warning for someone else?